Vasilios, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Can you
Thank
hear me
you.
all right?
Yep. It's a pleasure being here.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to the talk. It seems like a super interesting topic. So, first, can you get started by just telling us a little bit about who you are and what your role is here?
Yep. So I am an applied scientist intern working in AWS. And this is a project actually we started more in our spare time with a team within AWS and some external scientists from universities. So the main idea here is that we want to somehow create a knowledge graph that relates, let's say, different biological entities, and we want to use this for drug repurposing. I will explain everything further on.
So, what university are you from? And you said you're getting a PhD, I think. So, can you tell us a little bit more about what you're working on in general?
Yeah, so in general, I'm working in deep learning on graphs. So I'm concluding my 5th year now of my PhD. I'm studying at the University of Minnesota, and so I will be defending soon and in the job market. So, and yeah, so that's the brief introduction about myself. I'm also from Greece, and I hope I will go there if the situation allows.
So, where can people find your work? You have a website or anything like that? I think you gave me something I could put in the description, but anything else you have going on?
Yeah, you can find most of all of my papers in Google Scholar, and there you can also find links to my personal website.
Great. So, for everyone else, feel free to ask questions either in the YouTube chat or we have a Discord server. There should be a link in the description, so you can join that if you have other questions and ask there. Also, a disclaimer. We are both, Vasilios and I, employees of AWS, but in this context, we're not speaking on behalf of the company. We're just individuals here talking about an open source project and some of his academic work. So with that out of the way, go ahead and feel free to get started.
Yeah, thank you, Zach, for clearing that out. Yeah, definitely this is doesn't represent some Amazon opinion. So, as I said, here we are looking at creating a knowledge graph of biological entities for drug repurposing. So here, even in the title, right, I say some words like knowledge graph. So here, in this presentation, we will see an introduction into knowledge graphs, general knowledge graphs, where they are used to, some basic use cases, and then we'll continue with our application of drug repurposing. So, as I said, this is a joint work we did also with some people from Amazon and some other academic collaborators. So first of all, we have graphs in an abundance of different applications, such as health, finance, or recommender systems. And these graphs have nodes, and these nodes are usually associated with some feature vectors. Or let's say these are vectors that hold, for example, the age of a person or the salary of a person. And we can use, let's say, this graph data. We can utilize this graph data in order to solve some type of machine learning problems. So a very prominent machine learning problem is the problem of graph classification. So here we want to classify the whole graph, and we want to obtain a label for the whole graph. So for example, when you have a protein network, a network of a protein, the molecular network of a protein, you might be interested in classifying and finding the specific function this protein implements. Furthermore, we also have the node classification task. So here we want to find the label for each node in the graph. So consider, for example, a credit card network among credit card owners. And here you want to classify the credit card owners as reliable or unreliable. And also we can imagine fraud detection, some kind of applications where you have a graph that represents fraudulent transactions. And finally, this talk will mainly focus in link prediction. In link prediction, essentially, you want to figure out whether two nodes in your graph are connected via an edge. And this has an immediate application in product recommendation, knowledge graph completion, and also drug discovery. So in this talk, we will see how we can form the problem of drug discovery or drug repurposing as a link prediction on a biological knowledge graph. So, here, knowledge graphs, essentially, when we are talking about knowledge graphs, we are talking about a collection of entities and relations that are connecting these entities. For example, we can see here Mona Lisa is located in Louvre, which is located in Paris, okay? And we can see that Da Vinci, which is a painter, painted Mona Lisa. So essentially, a knowledge graph is an interconnected, let's say, database, or let's say, represent some kind of information via edge types that have a specific, let's say, connotation with them. So like painted or is located in. So going one step further, here I list some very large knowledge graphs with millions and billions of nodes of Wikidata, Freebase. And actually, all these very big knowledge graphs are also interconnected and form a single knowledge graph. So this is the good thing about knowledge graphs. We can somehow connect different knowledge graphs and build a larger knowledge graph. So there are some major knowledge graph efforts by big companies such as Google, Amazon, Apple, and Facebook. And in the next slide, we will see some use cases or success stories of knowledge graphs. So here, let me state that a lot of the content in this slide is, besides the part where we will discuss about our application, is taken from two tutorials on knowledge graphs. This is one, and another one we will see later on in the slides. So please, if you want more information on knowledge graph, just dive into these comprehensive tutorials. So having said that, let's dive into the knowledge graph use cases or success stories. So first of all, whenever you do a Google query, the Google Knowledge Graph powers and enriches these search results and also provides related entities. So this is a very important application of knowledge graphs in in enabling search results. Another application of knowledge graphs is in the IBM question answering system, Watson, which was able to beat human experts. And this Q&A system uses an underlying knowledge graph that represents knowledge, essentially, right? And also, a lot of these Siri, Cortana, Alexa operate using knowledge graphs in the background. And there is also some other biological knowledge graphs that are used for question and answering and decision support in life sciences. So in these slides, I want to motivate you about the, let's say, the universal application of knowledge graphs in a lot of different fields. And it is indeed a subject that you can dive into. So having said that, next, I want to somehow represent the knowledge graphs with a mathematical definition. So here we want to represent the knowledge graphs as heterogeneous graphs. So a heterogeneous graph essentially is a tuple of two sets of sets, a vertex set of different types. Here we have type T and an edge set of type R. So here each of the node types contains specific nodes. Here, for example, let's think in the previous knowledge graph, we have the painters here, and here one of the painters is Da Vinci, and so on. So then we also have relation types, which in the previous example, we saw some relation types such as painted or is located in. And these relation types connect to different node types. So to give you some examples, every edge in this knowledge graph or heterogeneous graph can be represented as a triple of a vertex, a node, a relation type, and another node. And these different nodes are essentially connected by this relation type. To give you two examples, for example, we have COVID here that causes ARDS, that stands for acute respiratory distress syndrome. And COVID, and this is a triple in our knowledge graph, let's say, and COVID belongs to the node types of type disease, and this ARDS belongs to the symptoms. Another example here is that Vasilis is Greek, and the is the relation type. Vasilis belongs to the type of people, and Greek is the type of nationality. Okay? So here, I want also to stress that we might have billions of nodes and edges in contemporary knowledge graphs that are used in the industry and also in academia. And as you imagine, when you have billions of nodes, you would like something that is relatively scalable, right? But we will see more about that in the next slides. So here, we essentially defined a knowledge graph with a mathematical symbols. That's what we did. And we see some examples of these edges. But in the next slide, I want to present to you how one can construct the knowledge graph, okay? So there are the knowledge graph construction approaches, okay, can be actually maybe categorized into two types of approaches. The first one is curated by a team of experts. So what does this mean? This means that a team of experts analyzes a text, let's say, and extracts manually from this text different triples. The other type of approach is an automated approach by natural language processing and machine learning models that is typically applied to large documents. So this means, for example, let's look at this working example. Leonard Nimoy was an actor who played the character Spock in the science fiction movie Star Trek. So an expert, okay, given these two lines, can extract, for example, these three relationships, among others. Leonard Nimoy, profession actor. Leonard Nimoy starred in Star Trek. And Leonard Nimoy played Spock. Okay, so an expert has to manually see this and write down all the different relationships. As you understand, this might be time consuming and also costly, right? Because you have to pay the expert, and the expert cannot process text in a very large speed. On the other hand, what the machine learning model would do is that it would extract automatically some relation types from this text. But as you understand, this machine learning model might be prone to errors, okay? And please hold that in mind, because these errors, these potential errors, will lead into something which we will call knowledge graph cleaning, and it's one of the necessary steps you want to take. Okay, so at this point, let me stress out why I have this figure here. So as in any machine learning model, the same with knowledge graphs, if you put garbage in, then you will have garbage out. So the main idea here is that if your knowledge graph is of very poor quality, so then the conclusions that you will draw from this knowledge graph will also be will not be good, right? Oh, okay. And at this point, let me point you out to the second reference or review that is, I believe, very good for machine learning practitioners that want to work with knowledge graphs, and is published in this reference. Okay. So having said that about how we can construct this knowledge graph, let me also stress here that there is also a very important assumption when you are constructing a knowledge graph. or when you have a knowledge graph actually. There is the open versus the closed world actually. I have a typo here, sorry. Assumption. So for the closed world assumption, essentially, whenever we don't have an existing triple in the knowledge graph, this indicates a false relationship. For example, in the example that I mentioned before, that I said Vasilis is Greek. So, for example, if the Vasilis is American does not exist in my knowledge graph, then this means that this fact is false. Okay. This is the closed world assumption. On the other hand, in the open world assumption, non-existing triples might be true relationship. As you understand, the first assumption might be a little bit restrictive because a knowledge graph, how can a knowledge graph ever be complete, right? So a knowledge graph typically actually presents a subset of the information that is available. So this means that there are some true relationships that are not existing in the knowledge graph. And this is the assumption that people typically use, the open world assumption, when they are building very large knowledge graphs. When they have very small knowledge graphs that are very specialized and they are typically curated by a team of experts, they may apply the closed world assumption, but it is a more rare assumption. Okay.
So a quick question here.
Yes.
What are the implications of assuming one thing versus the other? I think it'll probably have obvious implications in the way you train it, for instance, with negative sampling or something like that. But is there something more direct before we get to those sorts of details?
Yeah. This is a very good question. As you mentioned, a very obvious, let's say, thing is in the way you somehow train the knowledge graph, right? Especially when you want to predict new links. Actually, under the closed world assumption, whatever you don't have actually is false, so you should not predict. But in terms of, let's say, in terms of usage, okay, when you have a knowledge graph that has a closed world assumption, okay, then your machine learning model somehow, or the knowledge graph actually is ensured to be of high quality. So this means that the knowledge graph contains all the information that is out there. And you can make some inferences that will be accurate to some extent, right? On the other hand, when you have the open world assumption, this means that your knowledge graph might be potentially incomplete, and hence the predictions that you draw from this knowledge graph might be somehow not true, right?
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach, for the question. And okay. Okay, so far we will mention here a little bit about the knowledge graph construction. So next, I want to highlight some important knowledge graph tasks, which are actually machine learning tasks that one can consider on knowledge graphs, okay? So the first one, that's the most common one, is to predict new links in the knowledge graph. And by predicting new links in the knowledge graph, essentially what you are doing is you are completing your knowledge graph, or you are completing the knowledge, right? Because essentially, if I am able to predict new facts in the knowledge graph, is equivalent to that I am able to reason, right? To make some reasoning, right? So essentially, to formulate this problem in a very crude fashion, given the knowledge graph G that is potentially incomplete, we want to predict whether a specific edge exists or not. Or actually a set of edges, whether they exist or not. So a second very important task, which I haven't stressed so far, is entity resolution. So this entity resolution means that given the knowledge graph G, we want to decide whether two entities in the knowledge graph, or two nodes in the knowledge graph, let's say, represent the same entity or the same node. For example, because we have a lot of text with the President Barack Obama, we might have in some texts referring to President Obama as Obama, or just as Barack Obama, or as President Obama, and then a machine learning tool or even a team of experts might create a knowledge graph where it has these different entities as separate entities in the knowledge graph. As you understand, this might create some confusion to the other, let's say, models that take the knowledge graph as an input, because essentially you represent the same entity with multiple nodes. So what you want to do is to do this entity resolution, which is also an important task. So another disclaimer here is that in this talk, we will only discuss the first one, the link prediction. I just want to let's say, give you an overview of different tasks that you can consider in knowledge graphs in general. Another task that is important and relates to what I said before about the automated approaches to create knowledge graph is the knowledge graph cleaning, okay? So here we want to detect anomalies in knowledge graphs. The reason for that, as I said before, is that automated knowledge graph construction may introduce some noisy or anomalous links in the knowledge graph. So it might introduce links that are not true necessarily. Okay. So, very well. So these tasks actually can be addressed by machine learning approaches or by rule-based approaches, what is known as rule-based approaches. So, in machine learning approaches, actually, we will start reviewing some in the next slide. But for rule-based approaches, we will not cover this in this talk. But let me give you some examples here, okay? So, for example, if we have in our knowledge graph this triple that Vasilis is born in Athens, then we can deduce from this triple by applying a rule that Vasilis is Greek. The reason we can do that is we can say that whenever we have this relation is born in Athens, we can deduce that this head entity participates also immediately in this relation, Vasilis is Greek. So to do that, we have to apply a rule, okay? As you understand, rules have to be designed by someone and are not always also applicable. They have to be designed because someone has to put some knowledge and some, let's say, reasoning and try to write this type of rules, okay? But on the other hand, these rules might not always be correct, right? And even in this rule, the fact that I'm born in Athens doesn't necessitate that I'm Greek. So what I want to say here is that these rules are very valuable if you have them, right? And it is for sure a much more accurate way to do link prediction, for example, if you have a rule than doing a machine learning method. But on the other hand, these rules are somehow not very common, especially in very large knowledge graphs, okay? Okay, so if you don't have any other question, Zach, at this point.
Nope.
So I want to dive into some representation learning on knowledge graphs, where we will discuss about how we can use a tool in machine learning to do reasoning on knowledge graphs, or to do predictions on knowledge graphs, link prediction actually here. Okay, so here I will start from the formulation essentially. So here we want to learn D/1 embeddings for nodes and relation types in the knowledge graph. So, and these D/1 embeddings essentially look like that. So we have this triple that I mentioned before, our working example. This is node N, and this is the head node, and this is the tail node, and this is the relation type connecting the two nodes. So we map this with some machine learning model to embedding vectors. So this means these are D/1 dimensional vectors, for example, representing the head entity, the relation type, and the tail entity. So the knowledge graph embedding methods essentially define different scoring functions for triples, okay? And each triple essentially is mapped to embedding vectors, and these embedding vectors are given as arguments into a scoring function f that calculates a score for this triplet for this triplet. Some prominent examples of scoring functions are the Trans-Z model that applies here an L2 norm, L2 distance norm, that you have here the linear combination of these embeddings, where we subtract the tail embedding, and as you understand, and this is the score of a triple. Okay. Another scoring function that is a multiplicative scoring function is the dist-mul that has this form. Okay. So both of these actual scoring functions provide you with a scalar, which is the score for this triple. Okay. So a good, let's say, embedding model will try to maximize the score, okay, for triples that are true and exist in the knowledge graph, and will try to minimize the score for triples that are not true somehow. Okay. Okay. So to write down the objective function here, we want to minimize over these embedding vectors, okay, the summation of these terms, where here we have these triples, right, that belong to the D set, D plus and D minus set. The D plus set belongs to the positive triples, and these are the negative triples. And we want to essentially minimize that, and by doing so, we want to maximize essentially the score for triples that are true, and minimize the score for triples that are not true. And we do that by controlling this value of y, that is 1 if the triple exists, and minus 1 otherwise. As Zach also alluded to earlier, there is something called positive and negative triples. As you understand, a positive triple is something very obvious, is the nodes and relation types that exist in our knowledge graph, okay? So these constitute the positive examples. For the negative examples, we will see in the next slide, actually, how we can choose these negative examples. And it is very important how you choose these negative examples, as we will see next slide.
I have a quick question here. So on some of these equations, I'm trying to get a little bit of intuition for them. So for instance, the Trans-Z, it looks like you're projecting these three different entities, the two different nodes and the one edge, into some similar semantic space, and then doing some addition and subtraction. I'm not understanding what it's trying to accomplish here. So it has H of the first node, and it's adding the relation type and then subtracting the H of the target node. Can you try to talk through some intuition of why this is capturing what we want it to capture?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Zach, for this question. So first of all, let me state what I didn't say is that there is a ton of different embedding methods, and here I'm presenting the two most, let's say, basic ones. As you correctly noted, here I'm inherently assuming that all these things, all these three entities, are in the same embedding space because I'm performing the linear operations, but there are extensions of these models that can transcend that. Okay, having said that, going to your question, so how can we see that this model does what I said essentially? So first of all, let me tell you that if the triple exists, essentially, we want to maximize that term, which means, as you understand, if we want to maximize a negative term, actually, because this is minus some norm, so the norm is for sure positive, essentially you want to drive this actually term, the summation and subtraction, you're going to drive this to 0, okay? So essentially, when we are trying to drive this to 0, is saying like, okay, we have this head entity and we add it to the relation, and then we want that to be very close to the tail entity. So essentially, we are trying to somehow having the tail entity and the head entity very close in our embedding space, which is something desirable, right? So it's not, it's something you typically want, right? But we want to adjust for these two based on the relation type that connects these two. And why is that? Because these two entities might be connected under this relation type, might be connected under another relation type, and might not be connected under the third relation type. So because you want to capture this complexity that arises in heterogeneous graphs, and in this specific case, in the knowledge graphs, you want to have this flexibility by adding this term, okay?
So I guess if we're trying to essentially make this zero for positive pairs, and you were to kind of write that out, that the first H plus the relation equals the second one, or I'm sorry, minus that one equals zero, then you're basically saying that by adding the relation type vector to the source node vector, you equal the target node vector. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
Yes.
so it forms like a little triangle, sort of. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. If we had a 2D space, it would be a triangle. Yes.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. It was needed. Okay. So let me also advertise a little bit DGL, which is also, I didn't mention that in the beginning, and my manager. Okay, so we are part of the Deep Graph library team that essentially develops efficient models for deep learning on graphs. And our team is abbreviated DGL, and the website is called dgl.ai. And actually, there exists a very efficient, optimized library for learning knowledge graph embedding models. And this is the link for the library. And here I have the publication related to that actually library. And yeah, you should give it a try, especially if you want to train on very large knowledge graphs. And also, it has a very good documentation. So even if you are not a machine learning expert, you can apply this actually library in your problems.
Yeah, I want to add that I've been trying to learn some of this graph representation learning stuff, and the DGL website and its tutorials, as well as just the ease of use of the framework, has been really great and has helped me learn. And I've had several people ask me questions about some recommendations for getting started with this, and I always say the DGL tutorial section and their documentation is great, so +1 on that.
Yeah, thank you, Zach, for also the advertisement. And so having said that, also let me say at this point something I didn't mention. So this D actually that controls the size of the embeddings is an important hyperparameter, let's say, of the model. Because as you understand, if D is very small, then the representation power of this model becomes very small, becomes small. So, and of course, there exists a trade-off between a generalization error and how much you want to increase D. Okay, let me say something else about this model. As you can see, for example, the Z model is a very simple model, right? It doesn't do any, let's say, very elaborate any graph convolutions or anything like that. The reason you want to use simple models in knowledge graphs is the scaling factor. So when you have billions of nodes, you want something that scales to very large graphs, right? So this is why you want, and actually in practice, this type of simple models perform very well. Okay, so, and one limitation of this type of models is that they cannot inherently account for node features. Okay, so this means your node has some features. But in a lot of knowledge graphs, and in the knowledge graph that I will present today, you don't have a lot of features. And okay, so having said that, let me go back to the negative sampling, okay? So what do I mean by negative triples? First, I will explain to you what we do, and then I will say why we do it. So first of all, we have, let's say, this knowledge graph that contains these three relationships, and we want to create, let's say, k negative triples for each positive triple in this knowledge graph. By what we do is we randomly swap head and tail entities. So for example, you can see here, let's say here, this is easier to pronounce, Tom is a brother of Mary. So then when we go on the right, this happens, Putin is brother of Mary. Okay. So you see what happens here. These are our negative examples on the right, and these are our positive examples, our original examples. So as you can see, a lot of these somehow triplets or relationships do not make any sense. So these are our negative examples, which we wanted to use for training the knowledge graph. Okay. At this point, you may ask me naturally, very naturally, why do that and not do anything else? Or actually, what first comes to mind is why do that and not considering all the negative triples as the non-existing edges in the graph, right? So one could do that, right? It's not like you could not do that. It's a valid thing to do. One problem is the scalability issue. So as I said, 1 million nodes corresponds to possibly 1 billion edges that translate to order of 1 billion negative examples. So you understand that as we increase the node size, these numbers become huge, especially if you're talking about this type of negative sampling. Okay. One factor is that, but you might say, okay, we are at AWS, we can use a very large machine, and then this can work. Yeah, this can work. But then you are possibly violating the open world assumption that says that some of the negative triples might be in fact positive, right? Because if you consider everything negative that doesn't exist, you are inherently assuming that whatever that doesn't exist is not true. Finally, very tightly related to the previous point, is that the generalization error. Typically, sampling works significantly better in practice than considering all the edges. And the reason for that is, in practice, the open world assumption. Okay, so at this point, I have some questions for me. So what happens when, for example, when you are shuffling these triples and you end up with a triple that is in fact true? So for example, let's see here. Okay, actually, none of these examples make sense. But let's say that what the random sampling did is that it created a triple like Tom is brother of Joe, which might not be here true, but in general, it might be true. So first of all, the probability of doing that, of something like that happening, is very, very small. But even if something like that happens, there are approaches that somehow clean the negative examples by removing the examples that are in fact positive. Nevertheless, typically you don't need to remove these possibly positive examples in the negative set because it will not affect a lot the results. And also you want to be scalable, as I said, right? And whenever you are putting some complexity, you are not scalable so much. Okay, another thing here I want to say about the negative sampling is that what happens, for example, why we choose K, right? Why we are saying here K, how can you choose K? So in practice, we have seen that the K, if it is from 5 to 10, you get more or less a very good performance. And you don't get a lot of value increasing the K further than that, and you are adding more complexity to the model, right? Okay. So let me see what I have next. I think next I will go into more deeply in the DRKG. So let me say one final thing, which I want to say about DGL. So a lot of models in the DGL, as well as the knowledge graph embedding models, are implemented in a fashion that can be run in a mini batch form. So running a mini batch actually in a graph is significantly more complicated than running mini batches on images. But the DGL has this flexibility and allows you actually to run, even in a considerably small GPU, very large knowledge graphs. Otherwise, the knowledge graph would not fit into memory, right? And you could not train your model. Okay, so that's the last thing I say about the technicality about knowledge graph embeddings and representational learning. So So next, we finally move into the drug repurposing knowledge graph, right? So here, the motivation for this work is that we want to improve the efficiency and speed of discovering new treatments, okay? Why is that? We have seen in the recent COVID-19 pandemic that everyone is racing to find a cure for the COVID-19 and so on, okay? And actually, people cannot rely on the novel drug discovery, okay, which means discovering a completely new drug that might take maybe 5 years and it takes a lot of money. So what people somehow are turning to for the rescue is the drug repurposing somehow philosophy, where here you want to redevelop an existing drug and essentially apply it in a novel or a new disease, okay? So this type of approach essentially relies on identifying novel interactions among biological entities like genes and compounds, for example. So we want to, for example, predict what is the compound or the chemical compound, which means a drug, that inhibits a certain gene. So we want to predict essentially this relationship, right? That this gene is related to COVID-19, okay? So this is one type of somehow prediction that I mentioned here, but you understand by the word interaction, I'm alluding to the existence of a graph or a knowledge graph. So this is what motivated our work, essentially. And actually, there's an abundance of data available in different data sources that contains information about chemical compounds, genes, diseases, and so on. So these data sources use one of several ID spaces to represent the genes, the compounds, the diseases, and the others. So for example, one very prominent one we used in our work is a drug bank. And here drug bank contains drugs and their properties. Another one is the string database. This contains proteins to protein interactions. Another one is the GNBR, actually, that contains relations among biological entities extracted from text. So this GNBR essentially has some relations actually that are extracted from a machine learning model that reads publications in papers essentially. Okay, and these relations are a little bit noisy, and we applied some pre-processing to clean a little bit the knowledge graph. Okay, but let me stress that all actually the data sources that we used besides the GNBR, that actually the GNBR even has some quality for each of the relations that it extracted. All the other relationships that we collected from different data sources are we're almost certain they are true. So the knowledge graph we finally construct is of high quality. Finally, we also collect some resources from papers, recent papers concerning COVID-19 proteins and treatments. Okay. So in one slide here, we give the drug repurposing knowledge graph. There is a GitHub here repository where you can find, actually it is available, you can download the knowledge graph, download all the methods that we will discuss later, and you can start applying it and using it in your own research. And okay. Oh, another point I want to stress here is that you see the title of this work is Drug Repurposing Knowledge Graph, okay? So it doesn't say COVID-19 here. Why is that? Because this knowledge graph transcends COVID-19. It's not about COVID-19. It is about drug repurposing, and you can use this knowledge graph to do drug repurposing for any disease that exists actually, that we have some information about this disease in the knowledge graph, okay? Or about a new disease where for this disease we have identified, for example, some of the genes that are related to this disease. Okay, so here in this table, I have on the left the different type of entities we have. We have anatomy, we have, for example, compounds, diseases, we have genes, we have molecular functions, pathways, and here we have the number of total entities we have in the knowledge graph. for each of these relationships. So you see we have around 100,000 nodes and around 1 million edges actually. And here we have in the knowledge graph here a small picture of the knowledge graph. This is actually how the node types are connected in the knowledge graph. We see, for example, the compound is connected with the gene, and this number 34 means that they are connected with 34 edge types. So some edge types, for example, might be this compound inhibits this gene, or this compound upregulates this gene, or this compound downregulates this gene. So we have all this type of information. And all this type of information, essentially, we represent it as a list of triples, okay? So this list looks like that. We have a head entity, a relation type, and a tail entity. So for example, we have this gene here that is binding to another gene. And this binding relation, for example, is extracted from the string database, which we have here as identifier. And these IDs of the genes, actually, these are global IDs. And this is, for example, a drug bank ID for the compounds. So what I want to say is that we have all this knowledge graph in this form, in the list of triples. And this is how we represent the knowledge graph. So, Zach, at this point, I want to ask you, how much time do I have?
We can go all night if you want. It doesn't matter to me. I think this is pretty interesting.
Okay. Let me slow down a little bit because I was a little bit stressed. I don't have a lot of slides. I have 4 more slides. I just want to give, be perfectly clear at this point. So, okay, as I said, we have a lot of different relation types connecting, for example, different node types. Here you see the genes are connected with a binding relation, and they are also connected with a catalysis relation. And this type of information in the knowledge graph essentially will help us, train our embedding models, right? Our knowledge graph embedding models that I mentioned earlier, and we will be able to make some inference, right? So we will make inference by predicting new links or new edge types. Okay, very well so far, right? But I haven't really said what type of links, right, we want to predict. So, because so far we have understood how we can represent this type of knowledge in the knowledge graph, right? But how can you use it, or how can you make inference? So, okay. So what we did actually is that in this slide actually we give our interpretation of how you can view the drug repurposing task vis-a-vis link prediction. And when I say our interpretation, I mean my interpretation and the team's interpretation, not Amazon's interpretation. So drug repurposing essentially predicts whether an existing drugs can be used to treat a novel disease, okay? To put it very simply, predicts whether a drug interacts with a disease via a treatment relation, okay? So another type of prediction you want to envision here is to predict whether a drug interacts with a gene related to the target disease via an inhibit relation. So this type of predictions, actually, these are two types of predictions we can relate to drug repurposing, because we know that the drug sometimes acts by inhibiting related proteins to the gene. And of course, it is pretty straightforward to understand why this type of prediction leads to a drug repurposing exercise, okay? Okay, to put it even more, let's say, simply, what we want to do is to view drug repurposing as a link prediction task in the DRKG and use the learned knowledge graph embedding models that we spent time to introduce in the previous slides to score and rank the possible drugs for treating the target disease. And also we want to score and rank the possible drugs for inhibiting the relevant genes. Okay, so it is like an exercise, like what I told you earlier, right? So you calculate with your knowledge graph embedding models a score for each of the triples, And then you rank these triples, and the highest scoring ones are the ones that your model is more, let's say, confident that they are correct, right? So this is like how you can do this drug repurposing task. So what happens here, in very simply, is you represent every drug in this knowledge graph via a vector embedding, which we learned with KGE model. And also you represent the disease, which is in this context is COVID-19 disease, with another vector. And you want to see how close they are based on this treatment relation. And the same, the equivalent thing we want to do for inhibiting, okay? Okay, so having said that, let me present the first drug repurposing experiment we did. So for the first drug repurposing experiment, we test COVID-19 using the treatment relation, okay? So we have as a validation set 32 clinical trial drugs for COVID-19. So these drugs do not appear in our knowledge graphs and constitute our validation set, okay? And then the target relation type, okay, that we want to predict is that drug treats disease. And as I mentioned earlier, we fix the treatment relation, so we fix this embedding that we learned from the KG, we fix this embedding that corresponds to the COVID-19 disease, and then we compute the score for all the possible drugs and see how they rank. Actually, we actually, before presenting the results, we actually exclude some drugs. We only consider drugs that are approved, clinically approved drugs, okay, which means that they don't have significant side effects, okay. And this results to 8,000 possible drugs or 9,000 possible drugs, okay. And okay, so here we see that we rank 6 drugs that are ranked in the top 100 predicted treatments. So out of these 9,000 drugs, we select the top 100 and we search in this top 100 what is the rank of the drugs that are used in clinical trials currently, or actually they were used when we did the experiments. So here we see the score that we said about the scoring function before, right? So the higher the better. So this is the highest scoring drug, which ranks first in the list. This is the one that ranks actually fifth in the list, but is the second one of the clinical trials drugs, and so on. So here we see the rank of the drug and we see the drug name. So actually, what we saw very recently, June 16th in the news, is that this drug that ranks second here, and in the next experiment ranks first, is used, actually is they say that is proven one of the first life-saving drugs or whatever. Okay, let me put another disclaimer at this point, is that we are not trying essentially to find the cure for the COVID-19, let's say, or we are trying to provide a tool, okay, that will enable machine learning practitioners and also health scientists, right, to provide them with a ranked list of drugs based on our method, right, or based on the method that they will devise, because what we mainly provide here is the data set and some analysis on the data set. And given this ranked list, they will decide, for example, which drugs they will want to consider for prioritizing for their further studies. Okay, so I don't know, Zach, you have some questions here. I have my 2 more slides here.
Yeah, I do. I have a question, and I don't know if this is really the focus of your study, so it's okay if you don't know, but I'm curious if these methods have any kind of track record in the literature for helping, like these graph representations on knowledge graphs for finding drug repurposing leads or whatever. Is there any history of that working before, or is this kind of a totally new approach?
Yeah, so thank you very much for this question. Actually, in the last months, there are some approaches that try to do something like that for drug repurposing for COVID-19. But as I said, somehow, and there are very big teams of medical experts and also machine learning practitioners that are trying to do that. But as I said, here we provide mainly the data set, right? And this type of comprehensive knowledge graph lacks at this point in the literature, okay? But there are some approaches that they try to do this type of somehow applying some graph reasoning into predicting knowledge graphs. And I believe that there are some, but of course, I don't know whether they apply it or not. And yeah, to answer your questions, I had to read a lot of biology when I was doing this project because I don't have this background, let's say.
So we have a related question from the live stream. It says, do doctors or health scientists believe in this methodology? Do you have any sense of that?
We have some discussions with actually some, I believe, but I think they are very preliminary at this point. So I don't know how. I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah, it makes sense. So you're not aware of any success stories sort of prior to COVID-19 of applying this. It sounds like, but you're also saying this sort of graph wasn't really available that you know of. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. So yeah, this type of, so as I said before, so mainly we are providing a data set. So we are not so much providing the methodology. And actually, as I will conclude in my final slides, we are currently trying to devise some specialized models for that. But to do so, we need to apply much more medical expertise in order to make sure that, for example, whatever we are doing is valid and makes sense. But for whatever we have done so far, we are very confident that the quality of this knowledge graph, okay, of this drug repurposing knowledge graph is very high because of the way we constructed it, okay? And
great.
So, yeah. So the last experiment here for drug repurposing, we are using the inhibit relation, okay? So before we use the treatment relation. So here we are using the inhibit relation. Again, we have the same validation set of 32 clinical trial drugs. And here we are extracting from recent papers 440 COVID-19 related genes, okay? So we have these genes. We know that COVID-19 actually is related to these genes. And so what we are trying to do now is to predict this type of relation, drug inhibits gene. So as you understand, here we have our 440 genes. Here we have our one fixed relation type that is fixed. And here we have, again, our 9,000 possible drugs. Okay, so we, as you understand, different than before, here we only have we have 440 genes, right? So what we do here is we present the aggregated top 100 results across different, let's say, genes, okay? So, so what does it mean is that we get 440 ranked lists, each one representing one gene, and we aggregate, we take the top 100, let's say, predicted drugs, and here we report the number of times each of these drugs appears in the top 100 drugs of these 440 drugs. As you understand, the maximum number of these would be 442. So this means that 400 drugs, or actually 400 times in 400 genes, this drug that also appeared in previous slide is the top score, appears in the top 100 drugs. So this means that the model is pretty confident that this drug ranks high in this predicted list. So here you can see we have also other drugs with other type of numbers of hits. And the last column, frequency, tells you how high these drugs rank in the ranked list. Essentially, this number is one over the over the position it was found in the ranked list, and then we aggregate all these numbers across all these 400 lists. So if this drug appeared first in all these lists, this number would be 401. But still, this number is pretty high because we have a lot of different drugs. So, okay. So actually, this concludes somehow the second experiment. So this second experiment, again, somehow alludes to this drug being the top scoring drug. And again, the disclaimer that whatever we have found here is just suggestion. It's not some new discovery. And okay, so Zach, if you don't have questions in this slide, I will move into my concluding slide.
Well, maybe just one.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to sort of re-ask variants of the same question, but is there any connection with someone that is a health expert that you guys have collaborated with and, for instance, shown this list and gotten any sort of input, like, these make sense or not?
Yeah, think about that. So actually, some of the co-authors here, for example, are either biomedical engineers or they are working in health sciences. They are professors in health sciences in medical school. So yes, we have given this list to people, and this list was somehow, they were in line with the results. And another thing that I want to stress here is that all these results I'm presenting you here is by the validation drugs that we use, which are actually currently used as clinical trial drugs. So this means that these 32 drugs which appear here are used currently as clinical trial drugs for COVID-19. So yes, so this is relating to that.
In this paper, I didn't see the reference clearly. It's on archive. People can find it. Is that right?
Yeah, thank you for that. So actually, we plan to release it on Monday.
Okay,
It
great.
gets always postponed, but yeah, currently you can find most of this work, as I said, in the GitHub page. But it has also citation reference to our work, which we will have available next week in the archive. And so if you follow the links that we have in this presentation, you will eventually find also the paper that explains in much more detail all these things. And I hope it will answer any questions I left unanswered. Okay, so here some teaser about our future and ongoing work, actually. One is to enhance the DRKG by outcomes of medical trials and patients in electronic health records. So actually, this patient electronic health record is a huge actually data source, and some of it actually is even available in an open source way, which is surprising, right? But they are anonymized, and if we include this type of information, our knowledge graph will be able to answer more complicated questions. Because let me stress that our knowledge graph is able somehow, the main contribution of this work is to combine the different information and doing some engineering work to combine different information from different data sources. And by doing so, somehow the predictions that we can do by using this comprehensive knowledge graph are much better than the predictions we can do by using the individual data sources. And we have some experiments also in the paper testifying to that. Another future actually is something that we plan to release in the version 2 of this work, is that we want to extract protein sequences for genes and chemical sequences for compounds. And actually these sequences, okay, can be represented as vectors, okay, by models that exist in the literature. So what we can do by doing that is that we can enrich the knowledge graph with node features, right? So now we can say that this gene, for example, is related with protein sequences, and this protein sequence is represented by this vector. So now we have, let's say, this information in the knowledge graph. And as I mentioned, this will be available in a next release of the DRKG. And once we have that, it makes sense to apply something I didn't discuss today, which are the relational graph convolutional networks that process the embeddings as node attributes for link prediction. So this is actually something we have a lot of expertise on in the DGL team, because we are working a lot with graph convolutional networks. So here we want to apply graph convolutional networks to process these embeddings, okay, as node attributes and perform the link prediction. So finally, we have also considered some specific ways we can enhance the training of this RGCN by including some domain expertise. But I will talk about that possibly in the next presentation. So this is all I had to say today, Zach. I don't know whether you have some final questions.
Yeah, I do. First on this topic, I hadn't really thought closely about it until you mentioned the RGCN piece. So the graph that is currently released, none of the nodes nodes or relations have features. Is that right?
Yes, this is correct.
Okay, and then in the future, when you're adding these other data sources in, they will have some of them will have features, and then that's where you can really leverage the power of these convolutional methods. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I don't see any other questions about the drug repurposing thing, but a couple more generic questions. The first came from Discord. I don't know if it was actually directed towards you in this talk, but it came in the middle of it. It's about DGL. Can you just talk at a high level about what DGL is, what problem it's trying to solve, and make that connection?
Yeah, definitely. So in the DGL team, essentially, we are trying to develop very efficient models, okay, that are implemented actually in PyTorch, TensorFlow, or MXNet, and these actually models are either state-of-the-art models that are available in the literature, such as, for example, the graph convolutional network, the very basic graph convolutional network, or these knowledge graph embedding models, or, for example, a graph attention network. All these are state-of-the-art models. So what we did here, what people actually did here, I didn't do, is they implemented this model in a very efficient way so that it can exploit a distributed implementation and parallelism. So you can run, for example, these models in huge graphs by applying techniques like mini batch approaches. So you split the graph in mini batches of graphs, mini graphs, and then you train your models. So this is very important when we are talking about large graphs that do not fit in your GPU, which is typically the case. So what happens in DGL essentially is this efficient implementation of models, and they are provided with documentation where you can find a lot of questions and answers. And you can also have a lot of support because there is a very large team, and it is one of the basic, let's say, tools that people are using in this field, the DGL. On the other, actually, on another note, what my work in DGL and some other people here is to develop novel new models, okay, and solve possibly problems within that we are interested within Amazon, but also for customers, and possibly even more open source problems as this, for example, which, as we said, started completely on the side as a side project, but we ended up spending some considerable time to complete that. And yeah, I don't know whether that answers.
Yeah, that's great. The one thing I would add, and I don't have experience with the alternatives out there. I think one from PyTorch is called Geometric, if I remember correctly. But one thing that seems to be unique about DGL is it casts everything in a message passing framework. So it's sort of like the first class citizen, where most things are in that context. Do you have experience with other alternatives outside of DGL. And is what I just said true?
Yes. Yeah, this is true, what you said. There are some other also packages that also implement this type of message passing algorithm. But it is also important to say, uh, and actually there are some works, some benchmarking works that show that DGL can be or even one order of magnitude faster than alternative packages. And this is largely because of the efforts the team spent into developing, a very efficient fashion these models.
Yeah, and I like that the back end is flexible. If you're used to PyTorch, you can use that. MXNet and Gluon are very similar. You can use that, and there's TensorFlow support. So it's nice to have something that's built on top of a pretty flexible back end, and then you can kind of easily plug in those deep learning layers that you're used to, and use the same training loops basically. And it's pretty small modifications to add these other layers in. So it's a very nice framework.
Yes, it is.
One other question, and this is pretty far afield, but when I was first being introduced to knowledge graphs, I had seen some literature about reasoning, and you had used that word a few times. Can you tell us anything about knowledge graphs and reasoning task, and do rules that you describe fit into that, or do you have any experience in this domain?
Yeah, definitely. So, okay, so first of all, I have limited experience in this domain because, as I mentioned earlier, my work is mainly in developing models for deep learning on graphs. But recently, the last 2 years, I would say, I have been reading on knowledge graphs, and also currently I was working on this project. But indeed, knowledge graphs are heavily used on reasoning. Okay, and as you mentioned, a very basic, a very straight of way, like observation, as you said, is these rule type methods. That essentially you have some some rules that tell you, for example, if this fact is true, then that fact is true, or if this triplet and that triplet are true, then this thing holds. Okay, and as you understand, building on this type of rules, you can do some kind of reasoning. On the other hand, knowledge graph embedding models or machine learning models can be also used for reasoning. And for example, a very simplistic type of reasoning, which I mentioned here in this work, is to predict this type of relations, right? This is also a type of reasoning. But there are also more complicated questions which you might want to answer, okay? Which goes to the last point. So, for example, you want, to say, I want to find a drug to treat COVID-19 that doesn't have this specific side effect, okay? Or doesn't have any side effects. So when you ask questions like that in the knowledge graph, there are ways to do it with embedding models. So I can point you out, if you want, to some recent work by William Hamilton on embedding logical queries on knowledge graphs. That's the title of the work. And essentially, there you want to somehow embed the different types of, let's say, operators which you do. For example, when you are essentially having an argument or a reasoning, you are asking questions, right? So find me all the possible drugs. And this phrase, all the possible drugs, and can be represented by a linear operator. So to put it simply, there are works that do reasoning in both actually from machine learning and rule-based communities.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. This was a really interesting talk. And as you guys have additional releases, or as you publish papers wrapping up your PhD, please keep in touch, and we'd love to have you back and hear what you're up to.
Yeah, thank you very much, Zach, for hosting me. It was a pleasure for doing this.
Awesome. And please send me the link to the archive whenever that's up. I'll put it in the description. So next week sometime. So thanks again, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.